Okay, we're back. We're live here on ThinkTech. I'm Jay Fidell. We're looking from the east with Steve Zurcher, who joins us from Kobe, Japan, Kansai Gaidai University there, to tell us how his trip was to Hawaii and back to Japan, and to
Okay.
tell us in general about all the things that are happening in Japan. It's I wouldn't call it a mirror image, but it's close to the United
Right.
States and Hawaii. Hi, Steve.
Hey, good morning. Good to see you, Jay. Remotely,
How
it's
how
safer this way.
It is, and don't cough on the machine anyway. How are you? We got one really bizarre response on one of our shows posted on YouTube, where the fellow said, "I don't have it, and my friends don't have it. Therefore, it's all a hoax." The logic. I know he didn't go to Kansai Gaidai University. I know that.
No, no, no. We, we
But
don't we don't have those kinds of students at my university. I'm happy to
yeah,
say.
yeah,
I don't know. Well, there was a lot of initial propaganda and misinformation in the U.S. About this, and that it was like climate change. It was a hoax. You remember that statement before.
yeah.
And I think some of that still lingers, like Rush
Oh
Limbaugh
yeah.
and even the president to some extent said this is totally under control. You don't need to worry, which defied what was happening across the world. So maybe that person was influenced by those news sources, wherever they may be coming from. But that's certainly not reality. America's number of infections per day is skyrocketing. And as you mentioned, yes, I was in Hawaii. And when I was planning to return on last Sunday, but my flight was canceled. A very nice message from AirAsia: for operation purposes, we are canceling the flight, which means that there were probably 30 people on it. So I had to leave a little bit earlier than I had planned to, but that turns out probably to be for the best. I left on Friday and went through Japanese immigration. They asked me where I came from. I said the United States, Hawaii. They asked me if I'd been in China or South Korea, and I said no. And they just waved me through, and my son as well. The two of us were on the trip. So that has all gone smoothly. It was one of the most boring trips I've ever made to Hawaii because everything was closed. And last week, too, it rained every day practically. Still happy we went. I'm always happy to be in Hawaii regardless. Um, the last day we were there, my son went out to the groin, to Queens Beach, to do some boogie boarding, but they were beginning to shut down the beaches. They had the yellow tape up there, which is another visual shock. You can imagine the beaches being shut
Yeah.
down in Waikiki. So then I got back to Japan, and the news from the from the Abe administration is that starting Thursday, that's 3 days from, no, 2 days from today, on Japan time, all American visitors, whether they are Japanese themselves or other nationalities, when they come into Japan, they will be under a self-quarantine of 14 days, automatic. So anyone that comes in, if you're coming in as a tourist, which nobody's going to come in as a tourist anymore with this announcement, you'd have to stay in your hotel for 14 days. This is the same as what Governor Ige announced a couple days ago. And if you're a Japanese resident, you'd have to stay at your home for 14 days. The one nice thing I can say, Jay, about Japan, I don't know about the tourists, if there are any coming in. It'd be hard pressed for me to believe that they'll actually stay in their hotel for 14 days, but the Japanese people will. You probably noted that the infection rate in Japan has been very low. If you look at the graph of Western
Yep.
countries, I mean, it's like straight and up and to the right. Yeah,
Yep.
exactly. Oh, thank you for showing it. Yeah, in some Asian countries like Hong Kong, Singapore, and you can see Japan, the growth rate is much, much lower. And to be honest with you, I'm somewhat surprised because the Japanese government's response to the coronavirus for the first month or so was, half ignored and half kind of muddling response. So it's not that much different from the US response, but the infection rate, as you can see, is much lower. And I think it's true. What's noted here on this graph from the Financial Times is that Japanese culture is a very clean culture. People wear masks normally when they have a cold so they don't infect other people. That's just a part of the Japanese sense of belonging and helping other people. So I think to some extent that is helping with this particular crisis as well.
That's really interesting. I mean, I would have guessed that because you're right. I mean, people wearing masks, it's part of the Japanese culture and helping other
Yeah.
people. And that's it's intrinsic in Japan, and it's not intrinsic in the United States. And this is really a test of cultures, a test of competing cultures as to whether people will help each other or not, whether they will make themselves useful. Yeah.
That is a very good point, Jay. And I think, if I put my academic hat on, this will be a very interesting research project, is to take a look at the infection rates across countries, looking at cultural differences and collectivism versus individualism, right? Like
Yes.
Australia, United States. If you look at Hofstede's metrics, if you're familiar with those, very, very strong individualism. And you read stories periodically about people defying the rules, like in New York or even in Australia. People were warned to go to Bondi Beach, the famous beach in Sydney. They went anyway. So now the government has closed it. They had to take that measure because the individuals were going against their own best interests in putting their health and others at risk. Anyway,
Yeah.
yeah,
Look at New
interesting
York.
topic. Not that I have time to do that, but that would be
No,
really
but
something
but query,
interesting.
what are you doing though, Steve? I mean, are you under containment now?
Am I under a quarantine?
Well, I
No,
call it
no, I'm.
containment as a generic expression.
See, now you're triggering a cough response, Jay, when I say that. So I'm going to have to put a mask on now, even though we're connecting over thousands of miles on
Uh,
the internet.
I know you're okay, Steve.
No, I'm well. The mayor, the governor of our region, they're recommending that people stay off the trains. So I'm working at home as much as possible. I'll be going to Kansai Gaidai tomorrow, but for Monday and Tuesday this week, I'm not going. So that's one modification. My kids are not in school. Still, they've been out of school for the last 3 or 4 weeks. So that's affecting us as well. But the biggest thing, and what we talked about previously, is how I'm managing the Asian Studies program at Kansai Gaidai. So 3 weeks ago, we shut down all classroom activity. We went totally online with all of our courses. This is just unbelievable that we've been able to actually pull it off. The professors have been very agreeable to this, and they're allowing the classes to continue so the students can get credit so they don't lose the semester and have to spend another semester before they graduate. As the statistics as of yesterday, about 50% of our students at our recommendation, our strong recommendation, have returned to their home countries. So that's good. We were hoping that we would get a high percentage of the students to return home, given this crisis. We didn't
But
mandate that.
they'd actually be safer in Japan, wouldn't he? Just given the
Yeah.
rate of contagion.
Yes. So that was a big item of discussion among my emergency committee. And actually probably the majority of professors and administrators were saying we should mandate this. But I decided not to do that for that very reason. So we have one German university writing us and telling us, keep our students. It is so bad here that it's worse for them to be in Germany at our campus because there's infections on the campus there. And also other students, Europeans mostly, are telling us, we're so happy you're not forcing us to go home because Japan, relatively speaking, is much, much safer.
Hmm. You're talking about these, online learning and all that. And I went last night and I looked on the net for, online learning software, if you will, because I thought there might be one dominant software that's being used in all countries, including English speaking and not. But you know what? There are dozens and dozens. They're popping up like mushrooms everywhere. And I really
Yeah.
wonder, how that works and which one you picked if you didn't have one already, and how does it work? But what is it like to take a course online, in the throes of the virus?
Yeah, that's that's the big challenge that my school faces and hundreds of schools in America and around the world are all facing right now. It's just, education is so slow, so conservative. Basically, the way we teach is the same way Socrates taught, thousands of years ago. But now, all of a sudden, for many of us, the majority of us, we are forced to teach in a completely different way. Now, speaking for my professors at Kansai Gaidai University, they have taken up the challenge, and some are actually finding it to be some ways it's advantageous, but in a lot of ways, it's a lot more work than teaching as you've been teaching for many decades. You can imagine teaching Japanese remotely. You know, how do you do that? It's such a classroom-based experience. So, so to answer your question about the technology, there does seem to be a standard. So we picked Zoom because I had experience with Zoom through the American Chamber of Commerce. It's our standard product. And almost every university that I've interacted with or I've read about is using Zoom. So I don't know why that's happened, but they seem to be the dominant one. It's a great product. It's very stable. It's very easy to learn. So professors have learned it basically in an afternoon. Now, just by coincidence, I'm taking an online course myself from Harvard. I've been interested in online teaching. In Japan, it's relatively uncommon, and I thought maybe that would be a direction I could take the school. So I signed up for an online cases class with Harvard, and I've been in that now for the last 3 weeks. They use a different product called Adobe Connect, which seems to be a very solid product as well. But in the
I saw
chats
that. I
among,
saw that when I did my research last night. Yeah, that was a notable product, and you know, I'm not surprised.
yeah, the UI is very clean, and the way the Harvard professor manages it is very, very smooth. So I'm impressed with it. But the feedback from the professors who come from all over the world and all over mostly America, but from all over the world, is why aren't you using Zoom? Because that's what we're using. So we would like to use the tool in this online course from Harvard that we're going to have to use anyway, because that way I learn about online teaching and then I also learn about the tool. So that's been some feedback that I've given and others have echoed back to the
How do
Harvard
these
people.
tools work, Steve? You know, as opposed to a classroom setting. How do you teach? How do you convey knowledge using these online? They're not all the same, and I wonder if you could tell me, as a potential student, you know, how
Yeah.
they work, and maybe how the two that you're familiar with are different.
Um, so I still am gaining experience with Zoom and Adobe Connect. So this is very much a novice's response. But what you do, you just download the software. In the case of Zoom, with Adobe Connect, I had to do the same thing to get ready for the Harvard course. And then you have the client on your PC. And then at the time of the class, a synchronous class, you're given a logon and you click on the logon and then you enter into the class itself. And then each student has their camera on and there's a box with the picture of each of the students. So you as a student can see everybody in the class, and the professor, of course, can see everybody in the class. And then there's various tools that you can bring up. You can show your PowerPoint presentation. You can go into desktop view. So if you have slides on your screen, you could pivot from the camera images to the slides. Or there's a notepad, excuse me, a notepad. So you can actually write notes, like in a case study, the way Harvard does that, it's all done on the whiteboard. So you can simulate that somewhat through the tool. What the Harvard professor did a couple days ago in our first synchronous class, he actually brought up a notepad and was typing notes as we were discussing the content through the course of the class. That was very interesting as well. So he basically chronicled the conversation, and then after the class was over, he distributed that to all of us. So we didn't have to take notes ourselves. The professor was actually taking notes for us. So the technology has come a long, long way. And
Is it based
it's
on a
really,
lecture? Is it based on a lecture in the Zoom case and in the Adobe case?
you have of choices. You can show videos. There's a different types of formats. Basically, to some extent, you can simulate what you do in the classroom through Zoom. One other nice
Hmm.
feature about Zoom is that let's say you have 18 students and you want to break them into 4 groups. You do that with a click of one button, and it automatically
Mm.
separates the students into groups, and they're all divided out. So their conversations are unique to them. They don't hear the other group's conversations. I don't know how they did that. You know, so I've been in the software business for a long time, and software, when it's really good, it's like magic. So to me, that's wow. How does the software do that? Divides all the class up, allows them to interact with each other. So I'm actually
No,
doing an
I saw
online.
that when I did my research, Steve. I saw that
Yeah.
particular function in Zoom, and I said to myself, well, every self-respecting online software company is going to adopt the same thing. It's
Oh,
just a
sure.
really smart idea, and it's not that hard to accomplish in terms of the code. So you're going to see it proliferate and propagate everywhere. So my question
Yeah.
ultimately on this is it sounds to me like Zoom and Adobe and at least a dozen others that I spotted, they're changing this as we speak. They're making it better. They're trying to compete in the marketplace, and the
Hmm.
marketplace is alive with universities everywhere, in high schools too, and colleges.
Right.
So the question is, at the end of the day, we are going to see. Hopefully, that comes soon. The end of the coronavirus. We're going to see changes in the way education is conducted. My
Hmm.
question to you, and you're in education for sure, is: are we going to see more of this online teaching at the end of the day? Is it going to be more accepted? And secondly, to the extent it is accepted, are we going to see it emerge to a new level of efficiency?
Yeah, I'm involved with it's called a COIL class, a collaborative class with the University of Hawaii, West Oahu. This is a global external environment class that is basically conducted and taught by the professor. His name's Keith Sakuda. He's a good friend of mine. So we, as an experiment, sometimes, Jay, it's better to be lucky than good. I signed up for the Harvard online course like 6 months ago, and I decided with Keith last summer to do this online experiment. So I was involved with experimenting on online education when all of this hit. Um, so he tells me that at West Oahu, 80% of the students take classes online. So that is the default. And then I was just looking at the summer session because I'll be teaching at UH Manoa if the classes do continue there. I looked at the courses that are online, full. Courses in class, 20%. So students are already there. They are preferring, at least in Hawaii, to take online courses over physically being in the classroom. When it comes to Japan, to answer your question, online education, for all intents and purposes, doesn't exist here. When the main campus opens for my school, we have 13,000 Japanese students descending on the campus. That will be classroom based. I do not think that they have the capacity, the imagination, frankly, the guts to move to online education. So as I mentioned, education industry, as a business person looking at it, is very conservative, very slow. That's particularly true here in Japan. So I think for us, in my department, now that the professors are doing this, they'll have a different opinion, maybe a more positive opinion. So we could maybe have hybrid courses to allow students to log in through Zoom or other software through the course of the semester. But for the broader university environment in Japan, probably won't make that much of an impact.
It's very, very interesting. And it's also interesting to find out ultimately how the lab courses work. Because
Mm,
as creative as Zoom or Adobe may be, or the others, in a straight lecture in a non-lab course setting, when you get to a lab, that's harder. I
yeah,
really don't know how that works.
yeah. We have studio art classes, like a pottery class and koto class,
Mm.
those types of things. We had to cancel those because there's no
Oh,
way.
really? Yeah.
Yeah, so those classes are ended. So we're
Yeah.
giving
Too
we're
bad.
giving withdrawals to the students there. Yeah, for those particular courses, there was not a solution. But to the
Yeah.
credit of the professors teaching lecture-oriented or language-oriented classes, 100% of them are continuing their courses, which is quite
Mhm.
remarkable.
Well, we wanted to talk about the economy in Japan and
Yeah,
how it is changing and how it compares with, the changes in the economy in the U.S. and worldwide. What are your
right.
thoughts?
Yeah, we explored this in our previous calls, and I was, I guess, cautiously pessimistic about the impact of this. And now you can drop the caution. I am just deeply pessimistic about what's going to happen. So Japan announced yesterday that anybody who's coming from America, whether they be Japanese or American citizens or foreign nationals, all of them are under a 14-day mandatory self-quarantine, which means, as in Hawaii, the tourism will stop. So hotels are going to be running at 20% occupancy. The local Japanese people also are not going to travel at all. They're not going to take the risk. So tourism, 6% of the Japanese GDP, and the fastest growing segment over the last 5 or 6 years, is now at a standstill. Manufacturing, Toyota shutting down auto plants. Japan Post, the U.S. Postal Service equivalent, just a huge corporation, is laying off 10,000 people. On a personal note, my students who are graduating, this is graduation season now in Japan, they have lined up jobs. They did this maybe a year ago, and their companies are telling them, we're sorry, well, we can't hire you. Or we're sorry, it's going to be another month or two before we actually have you join us. So if you were hired by the airline industry a year ago, like with JAL or ANA, there's going to be no jobs. So the Japanese economy last quarter in Q4 shrunk by 6 or 7%. And the predictions by economists before the virus occurred was it would be negative growth again in Q1, so January, February, March. But now with the coronavirus coming in, I don't know, maybe 10% down, 20% down.
Wow,
It's
wow,
gonna approach depression levels, the negative growth. Now the government's responding in Japan just like it is in America with these massive bailouts. Trillions of yen are going to be forked over to these companies that are being hurt, and also there'll probably be a cash distribution. Japan has done that before. They sent money directly to Japanese citizens to try and encourage them to spend, because the response in Japan consumers when there's a crisis like this is to stop spending. They just, whenever these types of things happen, people get really conservative and we'll have to wait. Let's see how this plays out. So it's going to be pretty awful over the next quarter or two in
Well,
Japan.
in the US, we have an enormous percentage of people who live from paycheck to paycheck and who have
Right.
nothing in the bank at all and no reserves of any kind. And so, when they lose their jobs or their employers fold up on them, they're really on the street.
Mm.
They won't be able to pay the rent. They won't be able to pay for food, even if it was as available as it has been. And I
Mhm.
wonder if that you have a similar process, a similar condition in Japan, where people work from paycheck to paycheck and have no reserves.
Yeah, I don't think the numbers are quite as high as they are in the United States. Japan is, by most measurements, macro measurements, a very rich country. The savings numbers are just huge. The biggest pension fund in the world is here. People who worked through, the older generation and worked through Japan's growth in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, they accumulated quite a bit of money. So there's a massive pool of money with the older generation. But the younger generations, just like in the United States, each succeeding generation since the 70s or 80s seems to be getting a worse and worse economic deal.
Mm.
So people are not able to find full-time employment. Many of them are working on a part-time basis. The poverty rates in Kansai, which are some of the worst in the country. Kansai is the region that I live in, Osaka, Kyoto, Kobe. There's 20% of children that are living in poverty situations. So there is a definite segment of Japanese society, which is often overlooked or not paid very close attention to, that will be, I think, disproportionately affected by an economic downturn in the same way that you're describing will happen in the United States. But the numbers aren't
Mm.
quite as large as they are in the United States. There's more people
Well,
at risk in the United States.
happy to hear that to the extent that they have some reserves. The other thing was, I don't know if you had the opportunity to look at Trump's press conference yesterday or part of it. It was quite extraordinary, where he spent fully half of it talking about himself, and the other half, telling us all the things that he wanted other people to do,
Mm,
like the states, and we're going to a new kind of federalism, if you will. And
mm,
I and I and but the background of it, the underscore point is that the federal government was unprepared for this. and
Mhm.
is unprepared for it. And it's catch up on a major scale. And while we have to catch up, people are dying. And I wonder if the same points have been raised in Japan. I mean, was Japan prepared? And does Japan have to play catch up now?
I, to some extent, yes. The Abe administration was criticized over the first 4 to 6 weeks for not doing anything really of any consequence. And you may remember the Diamond Princess and how the Japanese government handled that, which was a disaster. They quarantined the people on the boat, which just turned it into a petri dish. So many more people became infected. So there were a lot of missteps by the Japanese government for the first 6 to 8 weeks. And then 3 weeks ago, Abe out of nowhere just said all the schools are closing, which is what triggered all of my panic and my activity at Kansai Gaidai. So he took a proactive step, but it was after quite a long time, and it came out of the blue with no preparation. So it's been nothing, some statements, and then all of a sudden a very dramatic decision, and then kind of a moderate response. So the Japanese response to the virus is not that dissimilar to the United States in that they really didn't pay very close attention. Now, there's one big difference, though. At least the Abe administration don't deny science. And they've never said this is a hoax. There's never been any of that type of misinformation, as far as I know, being spread in Japan. The Japanese people are taking this seriously. It's not, you don't have a segment of the population saying that this is somehow not true, or, the flat earth people. So we don't have that problem in Japan.
Mhm, mhm.
But I think most people would say that the response by the Japanese government has been mixed at best. Now, the biggest thing, too, is the Olympics. So I think in part the Abe government was downplaying the threat because they wanted to keep the Olympics. The economic impact of the Olympics either being delayed or canceled for 2020 is $6 billion. And the political prestige that would accrue to the Prime Minister Abe, because he's been a major driver of having the Olympics in Japan in 2020. So you read that Australia and Canada, I'm sure many other countries are saying they're not going. They're not going to come here now. They're making the right decision, in my opinion. So that was mismanaged, I think, somewhat by the Japanese government. They just didn't want to admit that the Olympics shouldn't be held in the summer of 2020, given the incredible chaos worldwide that's being caused by the coronavirus.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and sitting here today would be clear slam dunk. You could not do it. And I think anything like that we won't be able to do. And this
Right.
is going to be much worse before it gets better. And actually,
Mm,
what I'd like to talk to you about next time, Steve, is sort of from an economic, business, entrepreneurial point of view. How
mm,
does an economy unravel? How do you see it unravel? I'm not asking now, but I will ask then.
yeah.
How do goods and services begin to stop or slow down, and what effect
Hmm.
does that have? Because the economy of Japan it's a first world country,
Hmm.
similar to the United States. Supply lines are at great risk, and that means
Hmm.
that our lives and our quality of life is at great risk. So 2 weeks hence, Steve Zurcher, thank you so much from
Jay, you've given me
Kansai
my homework.
Gaidai University. I, I'm sorry to say, but I look forward to talking to you again. Be well, stay well, and stay home.
All right.
Thank you,
Always a
Steve.
pleasure, Jay. Thank you. Good to see you.